So, continuing our talk about graphing. Yesterday we learned what exponential functions are. They look like this, where the x is in the power spot. We learned that this number here is our y-intercept. And we learned that this number here is our growth factor. I'll abbreviate that GF. If that number is bigger than 1, it moves in an upward direction. If that number is between 0 and 1, it goes in a downward direction. So just to kind of give a quick little example, suppose I had this, right? My y-intercept would be 2. You guys don't need to write this, by the way, it's fine. And this number here is bigger than 1, which means that it's a growth. And when it's a growth, it's flat on the left, it's up on the right, and my graph would look something like that. We also talked about how these things have horizontal asymptotes at the y-axis. Okay? So that's what we learned yesterday. Now we're going to add some more information to that. What happens when you take your function and you add a number to it? Does anybody remember what that does to it? Makes it go up or down. Good job. So let's just say I were to do plus 3, right? So it's going to take this whole function here and it's going to make it go up 3 spaces. Now, notice that the asymptote is no longer on the x-axis now, right? It's at 3. So whatever number you put right here, that's basically going to be your horizontal asymptote. Okay? Now, yesterday, we also learned that the number here in the front, that's your y-intercept. But what's my y-intercept now? It's 5. Why? So why isn't it 2 anymore? What happened? We went up 3, right? So now my y-intercept is going to not just be this number anymore, but it's this number in the front plus this number here. Okay? So 2 things. One thing is that this number tells me where my horizontal asymptote is going to be at 3, right? And my y-intercept now is going to be this number plus that number. Okay? One other thing that we can do, this is getting kind of messy, so I'm going to rewrite it here. One other thing that we can do here is I can put a negative in the front of this. Do you guys remember what that does? No. That's if I put one here, if I put like plus or minus 2, that would move it to the left or right too. We're actually not going to look at those kinds of things. But when you make your function negative, it flips it upside down. So this graph would, if I put a negative in the front, instead of looking like that, now it would look like that. It would flip it upside down. Okay? So those are the 2 types of transformations we're going to look at today with these exponential functions. We're going to look at this, which either shifts your graph up or down, and we'll also take note of the fact that if that's a positive, if that's a negative, it's going to flip the graph upside down. All right? So that being said, let's go ahead and formalize that in our notes here. So you guys can start writing this with me. All right, so the first thing is that we said that the horizontal asymptote it used to just be at x, but with the plus c on the end, it will now be wherever the c is at. So our horizontal asymptote is going to be located at c. my y-intercept, it used to just be the a value, but with the c, now it's going to be a plus c. That was the original one, and then it gets moved up or down that much. So it's going to be a plus c. So my horizontal asymptote is going to be at c. My y-intercept is going to be at a plus c. Okay? And then the third and final thing that we'll take note of is the shape of our graph here. Now I'm going to turn this into a table that we can kind of use. I don't like how short that is. Okay. So yesterday we talked about how if your b value is bigger than 1, then your graph is flat on the left and up on the right. And that little dotted line there represents the asymptote. And we talked about how if b is between 0 and 1, it's flat on the right and up on the left. But both of those scenarios were with an a value that was positive, right? But if we have a negative a value, that flips our graph upside down. Okay? So if you have a negative a value, then it's going to look like this one, but flipped upside down. So that would be like this. Flat on the left, down on the right. And yesterday we saw that if b was between 0 and 1, it looks like this. But if you have a negative a value, it's going to flip that one upside down. So that would look like this. Flat on the right and down on the left. Okay. So we're going to use these 3 facts here to graph some exponential functions today. Our horizontal asymptote is going to be located at c. Our y-intercept is going to be located at a plus c. And then we'll look at the a value and the b value together to determine the shape of the graph. Okay? Let's go ahead and get started. Okay. Here we go. Example 1. All right. Thank you. All right. So we're going to look back at our steps here. The process I just went over with you guys is first of all, we want to identify our horizontal asymptote. The horizontal asymptote is the c value. That's the thing that shifts it up or down. So in this case, my horizontal asymptote, which I'll abbreviate HA, is 4. Next, my y-intercept is the next thing we'll look at. The y-intercept is a plus c. So this is my a, this is my c. So my y-intercept is going to be those two things added together. Negative 2 plus 4 gives me a positive 2. The last thing we have to do is we have to determine the shape. Now to determine the shape, we're going to look at 2 things. We're going to look at our a value and we're going to look at our b value. For the a value, we have to decide if it's positive or negative. For the b value, we have to decide, is it greater than 1 or is it between 0 and 1? So, first of all, look at our a value. Would you guys say that's positive or negative? Negative. Okay, so we got that. And my b value, is it greater than 1 or between 0 and 1? Yeah, this is my b value. 1/3 is between 0 and 1. So we'll circle that, right? So let's go back to our graph here. If a is negative and b is between 0 and 1, my shape's going to look like that. It's going to be flat on the right, down on the left. So now with all that information, we're ready to graph it. All right. So first, horizontal asymptote, 4. So I'm going to draw a flat line at 4. I'll make it dotted though, because technically you can't see a horizontal asymptote. It's an invisible barrier that your graph cannot cross. Next, we'll do our y-intercept. That's where the graph will touch the y-axis. We decided it was going to cross at 2. So that's right there. And then finally, we had the shape. We noticed that A was negative, B was between 0 and 1, and we looked at our little chart we had, and that meant that it was flat on the right and down on the left. So that would be my final sketch there of what that graph would look like approximately. Okay, so let's start by identifying our horizontal asymptote. What's the horizontal asymptote going to be? -3. The C value is my horizontal asymptote. What's my y-intercept? That's a little bit trickier. Take a little bit. Think about it. What's my y-intercept? -7, right? It's A plus C. So those two put together. So -4 plus -3 is -7. So my y-intercept will be -7. And then finally, we have our shape to determine. So we have to look at our A value and our B value. For the A value, what do I want to determine? The A is either what or what? Negative or positive. So is my A negative or positive? Negative again. So I'll just put a negative sign. How about my B value? For that one, I don't care if it's positive or negative. It's always going to be positive for the B value. For B, I care about whether it's bigger than 1 or less than 1. So, well, what is it? Bigger than 1. So we're looking for the shape where A is negative and B is greater than 1. A is negative and B is greater than 1. That would be this shape right here. So flat on the left, down on the right. Okay, so my horizontal asymptote is -3. So I'm going to draw a flat line at negative 3. I'll make it dotted though. That's my invisible barrier that the graph cannot cross. Next, we have our y-intercept. My y-intercept is negative 7, so I'll be putting a dot at negative 7 on the y-axis. And then finally we have our shape with a negative a and a b that's greater than 1. We looked at our chart and we saw that it was flat on the left side and down on the right side. So my graph would look something like that. All right, we'll do, I'm going to call on you guys this time and let you guys walk me through a few of these. Whether or not you write the guided practices down, it doesn't matter. I'm not going to give you anything else that's different than the examples. The examples might be sufficient for your notes. If you want to write them down, though, you can. But for now, just make sure you're paying attention and you're ready to answer when I call on you, okay? Okay, so we're going to do a guided practice. All right, Spencer, what's the first thing I try to determine? Yep. And what is the horizontal asymptote on this one, Spencer? Yep. That number there on the end. My horizontal asymptote. Ron, what's the second thing I try to determine? The y-intercept. And how would you calculate the y-intercept? 2 and negative 4. And that gives me negative 2. All right. Anthony, what should I say about my A value? My A is positive this time. That's the 2. And what should we say about my B value? Less than 1. So it's between 0 and 1. All right. Go ahead and take a look at your little chart here. See if you guys can find out which one would match that criteria. All right, so Ben, would you say it's the top, would you say it's the one on the top left, top right, bottom left, or bottom right? Top right is correct. So my shape is going to look like that guy. Flat on the right side, up against the asymptote, going up on the left side. So let's go ahead and see if you guys can sketch that real quick. So go ahead and see if you can draw a picture of your graph. I'll give you a moment. And I'll call someone up here to share what they think that would look like. On your own. Here we go. So we'll call this student practice. I'll give you guys 2 problems to do. There you guys go. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about a few weird things to watch out for. Take notes on this with me. No. Okay. I'll put three situations up here. So suppose you guys had something like this, right? What's wrong here? There's no A. We're missing an A. Now we talked about that yesterday, but I just wanted to revisit it again. If you're ever missing that number in front of the number with the power on it, it's going to be a 1, right? So nothing interesting there. We actually talked about that yesterday. But here's one for today's lesson that is a little bit different. What if we had something like this? How is this problem different from what we learned today? That's right, we're missing that C value, which represents the horizontal asymptote. So we're missing C. Well, if that's the case, it's not 1, but what else do you think it might be? 0. So if you're missing horizontal asymptote, it's just 0, which means that you're right on the x-axis like it was before, right? So if there's no horizontal asymptote, you're on the x-axis again where it was originally. And then finally, and we talked about this yesterday too, let's say I had 3/5, I think we talked about 3/5 to the x plus 1. Sometimes you'll end up with a fraction A value. Sometimes you'll end up with an A value that is a fraction. That makes kind of a pain in the butt a little bit when it comes to graphing. But what did we say to do about that yesterday? Did you watch the rest of the video yesterday? Change it into a decimal, right? So we're going to change it into a decimal, 0.6. Now, do you know how to change it into a decimal? Yeah? Yep, if you didn't know that, the way that you change this into a decimal is you divide the top number by the bottom number. Just use a calculator, 3 divided by 5, and you'll get it. If you didn't know that, make a note of it. But if A is a fraction, we're going to change it into a decimal. Okay? So, if you don't have an A value, it's a 1. If you don't have a C value, it's a 0. If your A value is a fraction, change it to a decimal. That'll make things a little bit more easy for the graphing process. But those are the only weird things to watch out for. Beyond that, I think we'll go ahead and call it a day. We have a little bit of extra time, which means that if you wanted to start up working on your study guides to prepare for tomorrow's quiz, you could. But we're going to wrap it up here.